Hello, and thank you for joining us for our final panel discussion of this year's Leeds Opera Festival. My name is David Ward, and I'm the Artistic Director of Northern Opera Group. All this year, we've been unearthing the hidden 300-year history of opera in Leeds as part of the Leeds Opera Story, funded by Leeds City Council and the National Lottery Heritage Fund. You can view our online exhibition charting 8 milestone moments at leedsoperastory.co.uk, where you can also see our concert recorded at the start of this year's festival, featuring songs significant to the project. Here this afternoon to discuss the tips, tricks and frustrations of unearthing opera's history is our expert panel. First of all, I'm going to introduce Sophie Horrocks. Hello, Sophie.
Hi there.
Where are you calling us from this afternoon?
I'm calling in from Edinburgh this afternoon, down south to you.
And tell us a little bit about what you're up to at the moment. I know you're kind of studying for a PhD over at Durham. What is your kind of opera history? What were you kind of looking at?
Of course. Yes, so as David said, I'm a doctoral researcher about to start my second year of PhD at Durham. And my primary research is about touring opera, primarily in France. So in the provinces in the 19th century, but it's also been great thinking about the same sort of themes in Leeds and throughout Britain in the same sort of period. So it's all very transferable, definitely. And there are some fantastic moments, both in French and English opera history that don't happen in the capitals, it turns out.
Yeah, and I'm sure that's something we'll come on, the capital versus the rest of the UK. Also joining us this afternoon, I'm delighted to welcome Iain and Peter Fraser. Good afternoon to you both.
Good afternoon.
And you are the co-founders of the Opera Scotland website, which is an absolutely magnificent website. Tell us a little bit about what Opera Scotland is and how and why it started.
Well, it started because back in 2008, Scottish Opera had financial problems, and there were all sorts of mutterings about how the money could be better used, the revenue, the funding could be better used, and perhaps it should be used to fund the Gaelic arts better. And someone, a politician who should have known better, said, opera has never really been part of Scotland's cultural history. So that got us angry. And we decided to put together information about the earliest performances in Scotland, and it grew and grew, and the website developed. And we've been working on it now for a long time, and it's very enjoyable. We used to think, well, who are these singers we've never heard about? And we've just added and added.
Well, it's a really tremendous resource. So much detail on there, and I know it's been very useful for the project we've been doing this year as well in Leeds. All of you watching at home, if you've got any questions or comments during the discussion, then please do write them in the chat and we'll come on to them later on. So let's start with kind of some of the basics. I'm going to pick on you, Sophie, first. So if someone at home wants to learn about maybe opera in their city, a particular singer, a particular opera, where are some of those places that people can start looking? What are those kind of basics of actually starting to gather some information?
Well, in this digital age, it's actually really accessible to anyone. And, you know, as a researcher, the techniques that I use will be very similar to what you could use at home. So my primary start is always Google. An advanced search on Google Books can be really surprisingly fruitful. A lot of old newspapers are digitized through Google Books. So you can search for either the name of an opera, plus maybe a location that you're looking for, be it Leeds or Manchester, or you can also add the title of a singer. And if you go to the advanced function, you can usually put in whatever dates you're looking for. That will often yield some surprising results, including in foreign languages. If you're looking for a particular singer, for example, you can find out that they appeared in a Munich journal or a journal from Milan in Italy. So Google Books is a really good start. I'd also advise people to go to their municipal libraries, because often your local library will have a subscription to historic newspapers themselves. And just with your free library card, you should be able to access past versions of newspapers like The Telegraph or other British newspapers. There's also, if you're thinking globally, there are some great MOOCs, which are massive online open courses where you can learn more about opera. There's one run by the Royal Opera House and Flora Wilson, and there's one on globalized theatre run by a Munich university. And through there, you can also have access to lots of different newspapers, lots of different searching sites. And that's all for free, which is fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the big things to say, isn't it? I mean, I would kind of third the things that you've been kind of saying there, you know, those old newspapers, whether they're online. I know we use something called the British Newspaper Archive, which you do have to pay a little bit for, but so much of that stuff is digitized and easy to search. The big thing that I found amazing about this project, you mentioned their libraries. I know it should be an obvious thing, but you know, you can, with a library card, you can go into your local library or your local archiving service, and you know, just ask for the things that you're looking for, and all of these amazing hundreds of years old documents, you know, you're welcome to kind of go and search through. And I don't know why that never occurred to me, but there's so much kind of at our fingertips. And the other thing you said there, Sophie, Google Books is fantastic. I mean, the other thing as well is Amazon. A lot of these textbooks or academic books can be extraordinarily expensive. But lots of them, you know, go to find it on Amazon, and there's the little sort of search inside. Sometimes you can get quite a lot of information from that little search. So those are amazing places to start. Iain and Peter, when you were starting Opera Scotland, when you embarked on this journey, where were some of those initial places that you looked for to start to compile this information?
Well, as you suggested, the local libraries, the various municipal libraries have programmes going back a fair distance. And the British Newspaper Archive, of course, has grown and grown and grown. Not only is there more information on it, but it's become easier to search. And we got a lot of information there. And we put together spreadsheets of company performances. And a lot of these companies have toured Scotland and England, of course. And we put together a schedule for their performances in Scotland, and that helps us dig out more information.
I mean, you mentioned there as well those sorts of programs and playbills. Again, we're very fortunate in Leeds that they've digitized a lot of those old playbills, going back from the earliest theatres in Leeds from the 1700s. And I mean, they're such an amazing resource to, as you said there, not only get the names of the operas and the theatres, but sometimes the cast members, sometimes the companies, sometimes the dates, and all those sorts of things as well. Sophie, kind of going back then to newspapers, I mean, there are some obvious things that we can find from newspapers, such as, you know, what was on, when it was on. What else can we kind of find from some of these newspaper reports? And, you know, kind of suppose what might we find in a newspaper in the 1800s that we might not necessarily expect to find in one today? What extra kind of bits of information might we be able to get from those kind of resources?
Well, something that we'll find, which we do find still today, is some sort of critical judgment on a performance. So newspaper writers, especially in the 1800s, they'd never be writing from an innocent standpoint. There would always be a vested interest, whether it's deciding that a certain type of performance, you know, a certain type of opera should be more popular. Then the newspaper critic is going to write in a way where they say that this is high art, this is really important for the people to come and see. Often you can read newspaper columns as a kind of manifesto about what one journalist thinks is important for society and culture as a whole. So that's kind of like reading in the gaps or reading between the lines. You know, how is the newspaper critic positioning The Marriage of Figaro or a new translation of a French grand opera? You know, is it important for that city at that time? Maybe it's not. Maybe they want to steer away from it because actually they're looking for more local, you know, entertainment rather than imported opera. So that's what I find really interesting. I also find it really fascinating just where a column is placed on the newspaper page. Sometimes you'll have an incident that's happened during an operatic premiere in the front page next to political news, and you can see that for that newspaper, that's you know, crucial news that's happening on that day, and that tells us that it's not just an advertisement. You know, in other newspapers you'll find it on the back page. So reading that sort of placement can also be be quite useful. Sometimes they give tidbits as to how the audience experienced or reacted in a theatre. You might get ideas of there was a riot, or there was such popularity that there were no tickets left. You know, those give kind of indications onto how people experienced opera, and that can be quite interesting too.
I find the audience reaction fascinating because it's quite hard, it's quite rare to come across a decent comment in a review about it. But for example, in 1857, Traviata came to Glasgow for the first run, and the minister of the Church of Scotland got in his pulpit and claimed it was an immoral opera, nearly as the time, and he evidenced the Times of London saying it was almost as immoral as Don Giovanni. And you can guess the result. The reviews said it was a sellout. The house was packed and loved it.
Yes, so some things never change there. No publicity is bad publicity. I completely agree with you both there. When you can get those audience tidbits, it's so useful. I mean, I've actually found that it's quite hard to find audience reaction. But as you were saying there, Sophie, particularly here in Leeds, you know, we had one critic called Herbert Thompson, sort of the late 1800s, and he wrote pretty much every day some sort of fairly long, very opinionated piece on the latest classical music or opera offerings, and kind of getting that social context is so interesting. Iain and Peter, I mean, you mentioned before that Opera Scotland sort of started because there was a lack of knowledge, interest, or empathy with Scottish opera history. I mean, from the work that you've done and from some of the resources you've been looking at, I mean, what kind of sense do you get of the importance or interest in opera in Scotland, you know, kind of going through the 1800s and early 1900s?
Well, I suppose one way of looking at it is to look at the number of performances and the number of companies. And of course, you know, in Leeds and North as well, there's a tremendous amount of activity, and companies would come to a big city and put on perhaps 2 weeks of performances, a performance every night, plus matinees and so on. I mean, there was an astonishing amount going on. And you, in most cases, that obviously reflected interest and demand.
And what about opera outside of those kind of big cities? So, you know, particularly in Scotland, outside of maybe Glasgow and Edinburgh. More broadly, I mean, how easy is it to find out about opera that was kind of going on outside of those kind of two major centres? You know, if there was a lot going on.
Well, it is much more difficult. I mean, if you put it this way, some of the lesser companies would go and perform in places like Paisley or Dunfermline or something like that. And so far, we've found that much more difficult to track down. Yes, we can identify performances, but it's much more difficult to obtain the casts because local newspapers often aren't digitized yet, and it's really quite hard work.
I've got a schedule of over 800 performances in Scotland of the O'Mara Company, and I don't think I'll get to the point where I'm filling in details on our website, but there you are. But it's fascinating getting audience reaction. In 1870-71, the Franco-Prussian War was going on, and a French company of opera bouffe came to amongst Britain, but certainly to Scotland, and did performances of Offenbach. And the reviewer in the Glasgow reviewer said, rather sniffily, that he was really pleased that so few of the audience could understand French because it was really quite smutty.
I mean, that one of those really interesting stories, and we've spoken about this before, Sophie, is that English language opera sort of moving away, and kind of what that means, not only operatically and musically, but kind of politically as well. And, you know, as you were saying, opera can be a great tool for sort of understanding some of those social and political tensions as well. Sophie, I wanted to go back to this idea of not only kind of audience reactions and whatnot, but kind of the experience of singers and the artists themselves. I mean, are there sort of any kind of useful places we can go to try and understand about the lives of performers at the time, trying to understand a bit more about how that kind of industry worked, that maybe we can't get from things like, you know, the newspapers or the playbills.
Yes. I mean, the whole work of any historian, you know, whether you're doing it from your bedroom or from your official office, is trying to capture the voices of people who are no longer with us. So we can find that sort of information in so many different places, but often it's a case of putting a jigsaw together. So, I mean, there are lots of memoirs of singers available on well, Google Books, if you look hard enough, but also archive.org has lots of different memoirs, especially the later 19th century and into the 20th century. Of course, these are often very famous singers, such as Gilbert Dupré, who was kind of the French tenor who brought the sea out into chest voice. He has a very famous autobiography. Lots of other singers, because they've reached that popularity, they were allowed and, you know, their stories were looked for. I do a lot of work on singers, you know, touring, and we have their names, but we don't know who they are really because they hadn't achieved a level of fame. So I often read famous autobiographies and then kind of think about, well, okay, is some of this experience, would it have been shared by someone who wasn't performing in Paris, but was performing, you know, in the sticks somewhere? And there are relatable things, and there are things where you have to think, actually, would they gain that salary? Would they, you know, get to perform the roles that they really wanted, or would there be other processes? There are also memoirs of managers, such as Tate Wilkinson, impresario in Leeds and surrounding area, which are available on archive.org, but also there's a 18th century website on 18th century literature where I think some of his memoirs are archived. Google can really find you some amazing things, but memoirs are really interesting because you have to remember that it's a singer or a manager who's writing at a point in their life where they've clearly gained fame, and they've been allowed to write this memoir. So sometimes they won't be completely honest about their trajectory or their working patterns that have got them there. So you won't often hear about the very, very hard parts. But I think a life as a touring singer was really difficult. And that's where, you know, if you match newspaper experiences with memoirs, you can get a fuller picture, I think, of what it was like to be a performer.
Yeah, memoirs are a great shout. I remember coming across Michael Kelly's recently. He was a very famous singer of the period, actually kind of appeared in a number of Mozart operas on the continent. And there's a very pertinent passage where he talks about arriving in Italy. And there's, I think there's a flu that's broken out. So he has to quarantine for 2 weeks before they'll let him off land. But thankfully, there's another ship docked nearby full of musicians, and they just spend 2 weeks sort of partying and singing and dancing and drinking, and they have a lovely time. And then finally he's allowed in Italy to continue on his journey. Iain and Peter, I know that you spent a lot of time trying to find the casts to the operas that have been put on the old performances. Why is understanding the cast members so important? And are there things that we can learn by sort of following singers along, or understanding kind of the operas that they were in? Why are casts so important?
Well, our database could be developed a lot more to show these kind of links, but it should be possible at some point to show career trajectories, I think, and see how much singers have moved around from company to company and country to country, obviously. There were some very well-known singers started off in opera, but then for various reasons, spent the rest of their career in oratorio or something like that. Now, we focus very much on opera. We've begun to put in a bit of oratorio, but really, all appreciate it's just such a huge area, and maybe one day we'll be able to do that better.
If I can make a point about stage names, if you're trying to put together histories of biographies, if you like, of singers, it's plagued by stage names, and some of them are pseudonymous, and you wonder why. And managers too, they took stage names, and it's quite hard to track them down. As for biographies, I've been spending rather too much time on Carl Rosa and his first wife, Euphrosyne Parepa, who, despite the name, was born in Edinburgh. But it's very hard. Biographies, I find it very hard to find much by way of stories in the biographies. But I did come across one about a singer. Sorry, my memory's gone a bit, but a singer was staying in New York, and the hotel manager explained that she was going to be put up in the suite that Parepa stayed in. And the singer said, what was she like? Oh, she was lovely, lovely woman, but she was very demanding. Before a performance, she insisted on getting a roast chicken to eat. And after the performance, she demanded another 2. And if you look at Parepa's pictures, she perhaps was a bit, showed in her figure a little, maybe.
Right. It's a very tiring business. You know, I don't blame you. You got to have your sustenance from somewhere.
Definitely.
So we've kind of covered some of those resources that people can look at, and I think the main thing is, as you kind of said originally, Sophie, is that so many of them are for free. Whether it is your local library doing some of that kind of footwork, or just some good old, we're going to say good old fashioned Googling. I suppose it's not that old fashioned, but you know, just kind of putting it in the search. Let's start to think a little bit more about actually kind of what we can get from this. I mean, there's obviously that it's just very interesting to look at these sorts of things and learn a bit more about the heritage, but kind of why do it? You know, what are some of those things that you've kind of discovered through the research that you've done so far, Sophie, that you know we think we can kind of learn from it, that might be able to kind of take to some of the work that's going on today?
There are so many things that we can learn, I think, from looking at the past. I mean, on a fundamental human level, I think there's something incredibly comforting to learn about people's past lives, because you see how little like the human condition has changed, how little the way that we relate to art in general has changed. You know, we've always looked at something like opera as an experience for escapism, or to you know, function outside of ourselves. That fundamental human need for leisure and culture hasn't changed. And then I think there are so many things that you can learn actually about social history of a town. Sometimes theatre and opera is used to push political agendas, or to involve the economy. I've been looking at spa towns in France, where the importing of opera and operetta is really important to them, because that gets tourists in for the summer season. So actually, it's more important to a small coastal town to have an opera company than to have lots of new bathing huts. You know, and they decide that in a council vote, which shows you that tourism and theatre are inextricably linked, and you know, that kind of cultural cachet, which is really interesting. I think that you can learn so much about the globalization of the world as well. We tend to think that with the internet and the 20th, 21st century, we're the most connected than we've ever been. But the circulation of operas throughout the world, and the comments that you get in newspapers commenting on operas, not only in London, but in Berlin, over in New York, and then into South America, shows a type of connectedness in the world, even in the 19th century, that I think is really interesting when we consider what it means to be modern and what it means to be global.
I think that's completely right. I mean, I've been astounded as how many singers went and did continental, international tours, how much the opera's traveled. Actually, one of the best resources I found for looking at some of the early 18th century English operas is Colonial Williamsburg over in the US, in Virginia, where operas would kind of come over to America from England. And they've got loads of scores. They've done a fantastic recording of early 18th century English opera. In many respects, Colonial Williamsburg across the Atlantic is a much better repository for this kind of information and research than some of the stuff we've got over here. again, Iain and Peter, kind of looking from the Scotland perspective, are there some of those kind of broader trends that you can kind of see in the work that you've been looking at? I'm particularly interested in how repertoire changes. We mentioned earlier how sort of English language opera was kind of eventually taken over by non-English language works in the sort of the mid 1800s. Certainly we found that in Leeds. I mean, are there sort of those kind of some of those big trends that you can kind of see in the Scottish work that you've been doing?
I think we'd agree, but we've really rather been concentrating on 19th century repertoire, and also the ones that are works that are currently performed. But there's obviously we've sensed there's a lot of work to be done on the 18th century work. And of course, we had a particular problem in Scotland with the Kirk and its the views that theatre was immoral, and it was leavened to some extent by music, but it really drove a lot of things we believe underground. But it was opera always was an international business, and a character I got fascinated with was Giuseppe Debenius, who must be known to you, who came with his little troupe of singers, came to Scotland 4 or 5 times. And he performed in Edinburgh Cenerentola. And one of our lovely discoveries was that was the first performance in Scotland of Cenerentola, but he had sung Dandini under Rossini's baton in the premiere. And there he was singing Don Magnifico in the Edinburgh performance. So it must have been quite idiomatic, one would have thought. And again, on international nature, after a few years, he went off to the States and performed in a lot of Rossini operas, putting it on for in the first performance of Rossini operas. And he wouldn't cross back to Italy again. Apparently he'd had such a bloody journey going over in the sea, and he died in New York of cholera after a few years. But these things, they add such interest to studying. It's not just about listening performances. It's about trying to understand the times.
Absolutely, and you're quite right. He's a very important character in Leeds as well. His company actually is one of our 8 milestone moments we've picked out as being the first opera performed in Leeds, not in the English language that we've been able to find. So as we said, that kind of transition is a very interesting one. We've had a question come in, Sophie. I might come to you. This idea of performance and historical research. We've spoken this afternoon mainly about performances and dates and casts and that sort of thing, but obviously kind of performance research, how opera used to be performed, how people used to sing, is such a big part of it, and in many respects, to me, seems to be a bit more of there seems to be a bit more of that kind of performance side of things. I mean, is it different trying to understand the performance research side of the work than it is kind of the historical stuff? Is that kind of a bit of a different way of thinking about it?
Yeah, definitely. Because obviously we don't have the voices. We have some early recordings, later 19th century, and people have written fantastic articles kind of reconstructing what was a late 19th century voice from those early recordings. But prior to that, it's fascinating trying to think about what is performance practice, because we only have newspaper sources that tell us how people received it. And we might have some scores which have markings, but often they're scores that have been marked up on the premiere, so that doesn't always tell you what happens afterwards. So I find this question fascinating as well. Some, bases that we have are that operas were very, very often not the only thing in a programme of an evening. So we might have a troupe in Leeds or elsewhere in the UK who's performing a ballad opera alongside some solo songs, alongside maybe a comedy which has inserted songs in it as well. And that might seem like a trite thing, but we're so used to going to see one thing on one evening now, whether it's Oklahoma or La Traviata. But the operatic event, wasn't that specialized back in, the 1700s, 1800s. So we're thinking about theatre as a multi-genre evening, and that's going to affect how a performer is able to sing. So in some of my research in the north of France, for example, there are evenings where my performers have to sing a Rossini role in something like Tancredi, and then they take on a vaudeville song couplets, as well as a spoken comedy role. So in my work, I'm trying to think, okay, well, do they have the technique to do all this? Or will they have a specialization? And does that mean that one of the roles they take on misses out on certain skills because they're actually maybe not a colorist or a singer, they're much better at vaudeville, but they're being forced to do, the Rossini as well as the vaudeville. One thing that we know for sure is that performance in the provinces, and especially touring, was considered to be your apprenticeship. So there were conservatoires, of course, we know in London and we know in France and of course in Italy, but not all performers came via those official routes. Many people would learn their trade on the road. And I think that the variety of repertoire that these touring companies had to learn shows that it was maybe a way of learning that was much faster, perhaps more efficient, kind of really learning on the job rather than studying your books in London, for example.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that I found most fascinating about the project we've been doing. So many fascinating things, but looking at those programs, and every evening would be kind of at least 3 shows. You might have your opera, then you might have a Shakespeare, and then you might have a dance or something. And that, as you quite rightly said there, Sophie, the singers wouldn't just be opera singers; they'd have to do all of those different things. And really interesting, this weekend for the Leeds Opera Festival, we performed Thomas and Sally by Thomas Arne, which was the first opera in the first theatre in Leeds. And thinking about the amazing opera singers we had performing that, the years of training that they have, but then back in that first performance in 1771, they would have been jack of all trades sort of performers. I mean, it's just fascinating to think about how those things have changed over time.
Definitely. I think it could also give us an appreciation of what the modern opera singer is, because the modern opera singer is a very, very specialized artist, 8 years of training in one thing, and often doesn't do crossover work. And that's great. That's what the 2020 opera singer is, but it's not necessarily what the 1820 opera singer was. And I think that just, knowing the differences can make us appreciate what it is to be an opera singer now.
Absolutely. Iain and Peter, I mean, you mentioned at the start there that there was the comment about, Scotland doesn't have an opera heritage, etc., 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 which really spurred you on to progress with Opera Scotland. I mean, kind of generally speaking, do you think that opera companies, singers are interested in its history and its heritage? Do you think they sort of appreciate it and know about it? Because to be completely honest, I get the feeling that a lot of opera companies don't really like to think of the past. They like to be moving forward. So I'd be interested to get your thoughts on kind of how opera generally treats its heritage.
I think there are 2 or 3 issues there. The first is that because the whole economics of the business have changed, and you're very dependent on government and other subsidy and sponsorship and so on, just that the number of performances has gone down hugely. I mean, Scottish Opera used to do a hell of a lot, 12 productions in a season, I remember, in Glasgow, and 10 Scottish Opera and 2 from Welsh National or something like that.
We used to see Scottish Opera in Leeds not that long ago.
Yeah. Anyway, in some ways it's much more difficult to see opera, and the economics make it more difficult. So that's one issue. Archives tend to be weeded because it's looked on by some people as a waste of space. So when you do get your hands on opera company archives, I'm often surprised, and we were often surprised just how little was in them. I mean, they kept basic stuff. Talking to singers, again, one of the surprises I got when I started this lark was asking singers, did they have any photographs of themselves in costume in a role? And they just looked at us in surprise and say, well, no, the company's got that. There are exceptions, but most singers don't they're so busy doing and living that they don't necessarily have a lot of historic material of their career. So those are two sort of general comments. I think the other thing is that opera tends to get subsumed in the general category of theatre. Libraries don't index collections to any great detail, so quite often we've found, and it's the same in Manchester and other places as well, you find there's a box of theatrical material, like programmes and other ephemera that came from a particular family, and it's not indexed in any way. So you've got to dive in and have a look and pull out the opera, and there may be some opera, there may be none, maybe a lot of comedy or pantomime or something like that. But it's time consuming.
I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, I've always thought it odd that, you know, the England or the UK doesn't have sort of like a national music museum. It's always the first thing I do when I go on holiday somewhere. I'm like, you know, where's the National Music Museum? Where's the music museum? You know, and I'll make that a place to go. But it's not something we have here. I mean, the biggest sort of, you know, theatre and performing arts museum or archive we have is those kind of couple of rooms at the V&A. I mean, Sophie, do you think other countries prize musical, you know, operatic or not, heritage and history much more than we do here? Just, you know, quite
loaded question. No, it's a great question. I mean, how would you prize something? Is it that you're funding it today, or is it that you've made a museum? You know, I suppose that's the first question. The absolute fact is that places such as Italy, France, and Germany have much higher state and also regional funding of current opera houses. So opera is, we might say, slightly more alive and well because it's slightly more impervious to things like coronavirus then. In terms of museums, I mean, I think opera has a constant relationship with its past because of what we call the canon. You know, most opera houses around the world are performing the same repertoire, mainly from the 19th century, every performance of the year. So I think there is a constant relationship between opera and its past. But it's a great question to think, you know, is Britain doing the best out of its operatic past? Because if repertoire is the past, then that, you know, who does that belong to? You might say it's international. Or if it belongs to a composer, then does it belong to its birthplace? In Italy, I mean, there are thousands of festivals, in all the Rossini festivals, the Donizetti festivals, the Bellini festivals, whereas I can't really think of anything specifically like that in the UK. I don't know if you can.
Yeah, not particularly. I mean, there's a couple of really interesting points there. I mean, that idea of whose kind of opera heritage is it? And then a big, you know, part of that, as you said, is that because opera is so fixated on basically a few sort of core works, which pretty much all of them aren't from English, you know, composers or English language librettists, means that, you know, where is that history that people are drawing from? Again, if you read program notes, you go and see La Traviata, for example, you read the program notes, it's all about Verdi, it's all about the premiere, you know, in Italy, it's all about that sort of thing, you know, but actually that sort of sense of how England fits onto that isn't there. And, you know, the whole reason that our opera company exists is to perform works outside the core repertoire. So I'm always a big fan of sort of knocking down that core rep, because I think it does hold us back. And I think from this discussion this afternoon, you know, there's maybe an element of it holding us back from appreciating our own operatic heritage, because we're so sort of reliant on that kind of continental.
I agree. And actually, one thing I've just remembered is that there is some great resources to do with Benjamin Britten. Of course, a local, definitely a local opera composer. Snape Maltings and Aldborough have, I think, if not a museum in place, I can't quite remember. There's definitely some great online resources. And there was at some point an interactive website for Britain's War Requiem, which was really well done. But I think by the Britten Peers Foundation, where you could dive in and learn more about the context. But I think, yeah, David, exactly what you've said, you know, how does the British reception of X work, that is not a Britain work, but Traviata, for example. How did we make international repertoire our own? That's really interesting. If I could for a moment speak with my other hat, when I used to work for English National Opera, thinking about, does a company value its past? Often a great narrative of the past is fixed to a person rather than a company. So English National Opera was, founded by Lillian Bayliss, a pioneer who wanted to bring opera for all. And there's actually a fantastic book called Opera for All about her founding of that, and Sellers Wells, amongst other things. But often, if we read something about an operatic history, it's fixed to a person, a famous director or a famous founder. And I think that sometimes that celebrity or person-focused vision probably does get in the way of exactly what you were talking about.
But a cruel question might be to ask, does ENO have an archivist? And they don't, they got rid of her.
Funding cuts, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, that is a really good book, and actually it's a very useful book, just actually English operatic history in general, I suppose, from whenever it was sort of started, late 1800s onwards. I mean, whether England needs a National Music Museum or not, I mean, I think it would be great, but I think it is indicative of kind of that land without music sort of title that we that we sort of have had to live with for a very long time. We'll park that aside for now. Iain and Peter, we've had another question come in, which goes back to audiences, which is about who went to opera in sort of the the 19th century. Was it they've put normal people, or kind of people with money? I mean, who actually was an audience for these performances?
Well, there was a big middle class audience for it. Carl Rosa, by the way, made opera popular. And he said that for a time it was very difficult for him because there was a snobbery. People expected opera to be an Italian. And he said he thanked the people in the gallery and the poorer seats because people didn't turn up to the stalls because they didn't think they were seeing the real thing. But he made it popular, and some of the it's very difficult, of course, to get attendance figures, but one from after Rosa's time for Carl Rosa Opera was from the Theatre Royal in Glasgow. The Rosa Company put on a 4-week season and they had attendances of 70,000, and they wondered if that was a record. That averaged 2,500 people per performance. And the same theatres there, and the attendances are restricted to 1,500. So where did these people go? Well, the answer is they sat on benches, there was standing room, and tickets were sold for which there weren't seats. The year that happened was 1917. Obviously, it was the middle of a war, and people wanted entertainment, and they wanted the great operas. Worth thinking about.
Yeah, I completely agree that idea of kind of making opera popular, and again, those sorts of things that we think of, English, opera in English translation as sort of being I don't know, something that people have always sort of railed against. It should be in the original language. Even in the early towards the mid 1900s, people were banging on the door of the of Covent Garden saying, you should be doing these in English. I think that's another point that we won't come into now, Sophie, but that sort of taking control of opera and kind of making it our own and celebrating it, doing it in translation. These are some huge questions that maybe we'll dig into another day. We're kind of coming to the end of our chat now. So Iain, you've mentioned a number of really interesting little factoids throughout this afternoon. So thank you. They've been fascinating to hear. I wonder if we could just end with just a couple of just interesting kind of things that people at home might not sort of think of, or might be interested to go away and learn a little bit more about. Sophie, could I come on to you? Is there anything that you've been kind of working on recently that you just think is particularly fascinating, interesting, weird and wonderful, that people might be interested to hear about?
Sure. I've been thinking recently about what I call the material culture of opera. So there were many examples of fashion or jewellery being inspired by operas, and this being something that's sold with the public. There were, so the Merry Widow, Frank Lahar's operetta spawned Merry Widow hats, which were even more popular than seats at the theatre. They would sell them outside the theatre, and there are accounts of, ladies fighting over the Merry Widow hats. And in France, I was reading about jewellery to do with La Dame Blanche, which is an opéra comique, jewellery and crosses in the style of La Dame Blanche. And what was interesting for me is that that jewellery, I was reading about it in a place that hadn't even seen the opera yet. So this idea that, an opera can be famous not because of the performance, because no one's seen it yet, not even because of the score, because it wasn't even in the library yet, but because the idea of it has been put into, a piece of jewellery, and everyone's going mad over this, operatic jewellery. I find that really interesting. There might be operatic other things, garments or hats that we're still to learn about.
That is very interesting indeed. Iain and Peter, is there anything that you'd like to leave people with? Just anything from your
Well, just a story about the first performances of La Bohème in Britain. Puccini tried to get Covent Garden to accept it, but they wouldn't, because Manon Lescaut had been a box office disaster, I suppose. So the only other option was Carl Rosa Opera, and to have it done in English. And Puccini was a bit doubtful, and he and Ricordi went up to Manchester for the rehearsals in English, and it turned out well, and they went back to London by train. But the third and fourth performances were given in a 2-week season in Glasgow, and the fifth and sixth performances were given in a 2-week season in Edinburgh. So Scotland saw it before London. But anyway, the thing was that the reviewer in the Glasgow Herald gave it a 1,400-word review, and Carl Rose Opera had put on quite a number of new operas which hadn't succeeded, but the reviewer finished by saying, "The Bohemians," because it was given in English, "The Bohemians, I fancy, is here to stay." So he got that right.
He did indeed. That's very, very prescient. You can't move for Bohèmes, and as I'm sure you've all seen, English National Opera, Opera North, and Scottish all doing Bohème this autumn as a way of getting back to performing opera. Our reliance on the canon is a chat for another day. I think if I leave you watching at home with something from our project, there are so many things I could pick on, and of course I'll tell you to go to our website leedsoperastory.co.uk to see the online exhibition. But I think the one that really stuck out for me was looking at the D'Oyly Carte Company. You mentioned Iain and Peter, that you'd have companies that would go to all sorts of places across Scotland, some of the smaller companies. D'Oyly Carte, such was the excitement around Gilbert and Sullivan, that at one point they had 5 different D'Oyly Carte companies, A, B, C, D, and E, going out on the road at the same time. That was how much people loved Gilbert and Sullivan, how much people loved opera. All sorts of theatres across the country from those 5 different companies at the same time. It's just a staggering amount of performances that we really can't get our heads around nowadays. It's been really great to chat to all 3 of you. Thank you so much for your time. So many interesting things in there. This is the penultimate event of this year's Leeds Opera Festival, the 15th of 16 events we've had on over the past 5 days. The final one is at 6 o'clock this evening, where we'll be announcing the programme for the 2021 Leeds Opera Festival on our YouTube channel. So do please tune in for that. A huge thank you to Sophie. I hope that in lockdown you've been able to kind of continue with your work and your research.
Yes, it never ends.
Well, all the best for that going forward. And of course, Iain and Peter, thank you so much. Again, I hope all the best with the Opera Scotland website. I dare say there's a lot more that can be added to it over the coming months and years.
And if you can ever help us by pointing us in a particular direction, you'd be very welcome. Thank you very much, David.
We will compare notes anon, I'm sure. Thank you to our 3 panelists. Thank you to all of you watching at home, and have a lovely rest of your Bank Holiday Monday. Not Bank Holiday Monday anymore, it's Tuesday. I'm exhausted.